There comes a moment when silence becomes louder than words, when walking away doesn't bring peace, but regret. Avoidants often believe that detaching protects them, that disappearing means control. But deep down, there's a truth they rarely admit, even to themselves. What they ran from wasn't danger, it was connection. And what they thought they were escaping from, they eventually start missing. Because real emotions don't disappear. Just because you avoid them, they wait. And one day, they come back louder than ever. Avoidance is often misunderstood as strength, but in reality it is one of the most misunderstood fear responses in human behavior. On the surface, an avoidant person looks calm, composed, independent, and emotionally untouchable. They are the ones who can walk away without looking back, who can silence their feelings, who can act like nothing affected them. But what people don't see is that this strength is not rooted in confidence. It is rooted in protection. It is not the absence of emotion. It is the management of overwhelming emotion through distance. At the core of avoidance lies fear, not always obvious fear, not the kind that shows up as panic or visible anxiety, but a quiet, internal fear of emotional exposure. For an avoidant person, closeness can feel unsafe, not because love itself is unsafe, but because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. And trust is exactly where things become complicated, somewhere in their past, through relationships, childhood experiences, or emotional disappointments. They learn that depending on others can lead to disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. So instead of risking that pain again, they build a strategy. Distance. This distance starts as a defense mechanism. At first, it feels like control. When emotions rise, they step back. When someone gets too close, they create space. When a relationship demands emotional presence, they retreat into logic, distractions, or silence. And in that moment, it genuinely feels like power. They tell themselves they are being mature. They tell themselves they are choosing peace over chaos. They tell themselves they are simply not the type to get too attached. But what they don't realize is that avoidance does not eliminate emotional capacity. It only delays emotional processing. Feelings that are not expressed do not disappear. They go underground. They stay in the body, in memory, in subconscious thought patterns. So while externally they may seem unaffected, internally there is a build-up happening over time. Every ignored emotion adds weight. Every unspoken feeling adds pressure. Every avoided conversation becomes unfinished business in the mind. The irony is that avoidants often feel deeply. They just struggle to stay present with what they feel. So instead of sitting in discomfort and working through emotional intensity, they escape it. And because escape works in the short term, the brain reinforces it. This is why avoidance becomes a cycle. Feel something intense, pull away, feel temporary relief, repeat. Over time, this pattern starts to feel like identity. I am someone who doesn't need anyone. I am fine on my own. I don't get attached easily. But these statements are not always truths. They are protective narratives built around emotional survival. What makes avoidance feel like strength is that it creates the illusion of stability. No emotional chaos, no dependency, no visible heartbreak. But underneath that stability is something quieter and heavier. Emotional disconnection. Because when you repeatedly avoid emotional depth, you don't just avoid pain. You also avoid intimacy, joy, bonding, and the full experience of being human in relationships. Eventually, this strength starts to show its limits. In moments of silence, after relationships end, or when life becomes emotionally demanding, the avoided feelings begin to surface. Not all at once, but in fragments. Regret, curiosity, memories, what-ifs. And that is when the realization slowly forms. What felt like control was actually distance from connection. Every emotion a person feels carries energy, and that energy is meant to move through expression, understanding, and release. But when emotions are suppressed instead of processed, they don't disappear, they get stored. Avoidant individuals often develop the habit of pushing feelings away the moment they become uncomfortable. Instead of sitting with emotional discomfort, they disconnect from it. Instead of expressing what hurts, they rationalize it. Instead of talking about what they feel, they silence it. On the surface, this seems like control. But internally, it is a slow accumulation of unresolved emotional weight. Emotional suppression doesn't always look dramatic. It can be subtle. It can look like changing the subject when something gets too personal. It can look like going silent instead of explaining feelings. It can look like convincing oneself that something doesn't matter anymore, when in reality it does. Each time an emotion is dismissed, the mind learns a pattern: avoid discomfort rather than process it. And while this brings temporary relief, it also creates long-term emotional backlog. What makes this even more complex is that avoidant individuals are often very self-aware on a logical level. They can understand emotions intellectually without actually feeling them fully. They can explain why something hurt them without allowing themselves to sit inside that hurt. This separation between thinking and feeling becomes a coping mechanism. It allows them to stay functional, calm, and independent. But emotional health is not built on suppression. It is built on integration. When feelings are consistently pushed aside, they don't dissolve, they accumulate in the background of the mind. Over time, this accumulation begins to show itself in unexpected ways. It may not appear immediately as sadness or regret. Instead, it can surface as emotional numbness, irritability, fatigue, or a sense of emptiness that is difficult to explain. The person may feel fine, but disconnected. They may be surrounded by life, conversations, and relationships, yet still feel internally distant from it all. This is because unprocessed emotions don't stay silent forever. They resurface in disguised forms. One of the most powerful illusions avoidance creates is the belief that time heals everything automatically. So instead of processing pain, they delay it. They convince themselves that if they ignore it long enough, it will fade. And sometimes, externally, it seems to fade. But internally, it often transforms rather than disappears. What was once hurt becomes emotional distance. What was once sadness becomes detachment. What was once fear becomes avoidance of deeper intimacy. The emotion doesn't vanish, it changes shape. The cost of this emotional postponement becomes more visible in moments of stillness, when distractions fade, when relationships end, or when life slows down. All the unprocessed emotions begin to surface at once. This is often when avoidant individuals feel overwhelmed, not because something new is happening, but because everything they never dealt with is finally demanding attention. Regret is often one of the first emotions to appear. Not always regret for what they did, but for what they didn't allow themselves to feel. There is also a quiet loneliness that builds over time. Not necessarily loneliness from lack of people, but loneliness from lack of emotional expression. When someone repeatedly avoids vulnerability, they also limit the depth of their connections. Conversations remain surface level. Relationships remain controlled. Emotional intimacy remains partially blocked. And without realizing it, they begin to feel like something important is missing, even when everything appears stable on the outside. Emotional suppression is not a solution, it is a delay. It postpones healing, but it does not remove the need for it. Every avoided emotion eventually asks to be felt, and when it does, it often arrives with greater intensity than it originally carried. When an avoidant person chooses to leave, withdraw, or emotionally detach, it often looks final from the outside. It can seem sudden, clean, and decisive. To the other person, it may feel like the end of the story. But internally, for the avoidant, That moment is rarely an ending. It is the beginning of emotional processing that they delayed while still in the connection. What looks like closure on the surface is often the start of delayed realization beneath it. In the early phase of separation or distance, there is usually a strong sense of relief. The emotional pressure that once felt overwhelming is gone. There are no more difficult conversations, no email. Stopped expectations, no need to respond deeply or stay vulnerable. This absence of pressure creates a feeling that is often mistaken for peace. The mind tells itself, I did the right thing, or I needed space, or I feel better now. And in that moment, those thoughts genuinely feel true. But relief is not the same as resolution. Relief is what happens when emotional intensity stops. Resolution is what happens when emotional understanding begins. And avoidant individuals often confuse the two because their coping mechanism is distance. The removal of emotional closeness automatically signals safety to their nervous system. However, just because the intensity is gone does not mean the emotional meaning has been processed. As time passes, the silence that once felt comfortable begins to shift. The absence of the other person does not remain empty. It starts to gain presence in memory. Small things trigger recollection. Familiar places, conversations that were left unfinished, moments that were dismissed too quickly. What the avoidant mind had previously compartmentalized begins to resurface in fragments, not all at once, but gradually, like pieces of something unfinished returning to awareness. This is where realization slowly begins to form. It is not immediate regret in most cases. It is subtle awareness, the understanding that what was once labeled as too much might not have been as overwhelming as it felt in the moment. The recognition that emotional closeness was not necessarily danger, but depth, and depth is something avoidant individuals often only understand after it is no longer available. The mind also begins to replay emotional snapshots, but in a different emotional state. During the relationship, moments of closeness may have felt intense or suffocating. After the separation, those same moments are remembered differently, not as pressure, but as not as control, but as connection. This shift in emotional interpretation is what creates the feeling of loss that was not fully present at the moment of leaving. One of the most difficult parts of this stage is that realization does not always lead to action. Avoidant patterns are deeply ingrained. Even when they recognize that something meaningful was lost, the instinct to protect themselves often remains stronger than the desire to reconnect. So they may sit in reflection without expression, in understanding without communication, in emotion without resolution. This creates a quiet, internal conflict, knowing something mattered, but still struggling to move toward it. Over time, this leads to a more complex emotional experience. Not just missing the person, but missing the version of themselves that existed in that connection. Because relationships often activate parts of us that solitude cannot. In connection, there is emotional expansion. In avoidance, there is emotional control. When the connection ends, both the person and the emotional version of self tied to that relationship become memories. So the moment they leave is not the end of feeling. It is the beginning of understanding. It is the point where avoidance stops working as a shield and starts becoming a mirror. But in that mirror, they begin to see what distance protected them from, but also what it cost them to maintain it. Independence is one of the most misunderstood concepts in emotional behavior, especially when it comes to avoidant individuals. On the surface, they often appear highly self-sufficient, disciplined, and capable of handling life on their own. They may take pride in not relying on others, not needing constant reassurance, and not becoming emotionally dependent. In many ways, this looks like strength, and in healthy forms, it absolutely can be. But when independence becomes a shield, D against emotional closeness, it slowly shifts into something very different: emotional isolation. The core issue is not independence itself, but the motivation behind it. True independence is rooted in choice, the ability to be with others without losing oneself, and to be alone without feeling incomplete. It is flexible. It allows connection without fear and solitude without emptiness. But for avoidant individuals, independence is often not just a preference. It becomes a protective strategy. It is built around the belief that relying on others leads to disappointment, vulnerability leads to pain, and closeness eventually results in loss of control. Because of this belief system, they start equating emotional distance with safety. The more they rely on themselves, the more secure they feel, but only temporarily. Over time, this self-reliance can begin to narrow their emotional world. They become comfortable handling everything internally. They solve problems alone, process emotions alone, and carry burdens alone. While this may seem admirable from the outside, it slowly reduces opportunities for emotional connection, shared vulnerability, and mutual support. What makes this pattern especially complex is that avoidant individuals often don't feel the effects of isolation immediately. In the beginning, solitude feels empowering. There is no emotional conflict, no dependency, no fear of being misunderstood. Life feels controlled and predictable. But emotional needs do not disappear simply because they are ignored. Humans are wired for connection, and even the most independent person still has emotional needs that require expression and recognition. As time goes on, emotional isolation begins to reveal itself in quieter ways. It may not show up as obvious loneliness at first. Instead, it can appear as a sense of disconnection from others, difficulty opening up even one. When trust is present, or a feeling that relationships never quite reach depth. They may be surrounded by people, yet still feel emotionally untouched by those connections. Conversations happen, interactions continue, but something deeper remains absent. Another layer of this experience is the internal conflict it creates. On one side, there is pride in being self-sufficient. On the other side, there is a subtle, often unspoken longing for emotional closeness. This creates a push and pull dynamic within the self. The desire for connection arises, but the instinct for protection intervenes. So instead of moving toward people, they move back into themselves. And each time this cycle repeats, the gap between independence and intimacy grows wider. Over time, what was once a strength begins to feel like limitation. Emotional self-reliance turns into emotional restriction. The ability to handle everything alone becomes the inability to share anything deeply. And while they may not always consciously recognize it, there can be a quiet sense that something essential is missing from their emotional life. The most ironic part is that true emotional independence does not require isolation. In fact, it is built through secure connection, learning that closeness does not equal loss of self. But avoidant patterns often prevent this realization from fully forming in real time. Instead, it tends to surface later, in reflection, when distance has already become habitual. So what begins as "I don't need anyone" slowly transforms into something more complicated. "I don't let anyone in." And in that shift, independence stops being freedom and starts becoming a barrier, not to the world, but to emotional depth within it. What people often fail to understand about emotional attachment is that the heart does not follow logic. It follows experience. When someone enters your emotional world, they leave behind impressions that don't easily fade, even if the relationship ends or the distance grows. For avoidant individuals, this becomes especially complicated because they often label emotional closeness as too much in the moment, only to later realize that what they pushed away was also what made them feel deeply connected and alive. During the connection, certain things may feel overwhelming to an avoidant mind: consistent attention, emotional needs, vulnerability, or expectations of closeness. In those moments, the instinct is to step back, create distance, and regain a sense of control. The emotional intensity is interpreted as pressure rather than care. So they detach, convince themselves they are better off, and move into emotional self-protection. At that stage, leaving or pulling away feels like the right decision because it reduces internal discomfort. But emotional perception is not fixed. It changes with distance. Once the intensity fades and the space becomes quiet, the same memories that once felt heavy begin to transform. What was previously experienced as pressure is later remembered as affection. What felt like emotional demand starts to appear as genuine care. What was once too much slowly reveals itself as depth, consistency, and emotional presence. This shift happens because absence changes interpretation. When someone is no longer actively present in your daily emotional environment, your mind is no longer reacting defensively to them. Instead, it begins to process them. And in that processing, the emotional weight softens, allowing clarity to form. This is where the realization begins that what was pushed away was not harm. It was connection expressed in a way that felt unfamiliar or intense at the time. The human mind is also wired to remember emotional significance more strongly than routine experience. So even if an avoidant person unconvinced themselves that distancing was the solution, the emotional memory of the relationship does not disappear. It resurfaces in quiet moments, when distractions fade, when life slows down, or when something triggers association, a place, a song, a phrase, or even a feeling of loneliness can reopen the emotional file that was never fully closed. What makes this experience even more powerful is that the memory is no longer filtered through avoidance. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they begin to feel reflective. Instead of pushing away emotion, they begin to sit with it. And in that stillness, they start to recognize nuances they could not fully process while inside the relationship. The consistency that once felt intense is now seen as stability. The emotional availability that once felt demanding is now seen as rare. The care that once felt like pressure is now understood as value. This is where longing begins to form, not just for the person, but for what the connection represented emotionally. It is not always about wanting the relationship back in its exact form. Sometimes it is about missing the feeling of being understood, being cared for, or being emotionally seen. And for avoidant individuals, this realization can be particularly difficult because it challenges the original belief that distance equals safety and closeness equals discomfort. However, insight does not always translate into action. Even when they recognize what they lost, the same protective instincts that caused them to withdraw in the first place often remain active. So they may stay in a space of quiet reflection, aware of the value they once had access to, yet uncertain how to re-enter emotional vulnerability without repeating old patterns. In the end, what they ran from does not disappear. It stays within emotional memory, reshaped by time and absence. And often it is only after this, Tance has done its work, that they begin to understand the true nature of what they once labeled as too much. Growth does not begin in avoidance, it begins in awareness. For an avoidant individual, the pattern of distancing, suppressing, and disconnecting often feels like the safest way to navigate emotional experiences. It protects them from discomfort in the short term, and it gives them a sense of control over situations that feel emotionally overwhelming. But real emotional development does not come from staying comfortable. It comes from confronting what has been avoided for a long time and choosing to engage with it differently. The moment growth becomes possible is the moment a person stops automatically reacting and starts observing themselves. Instead of immediately pulling away, when emotions rise, they begin to notice the pattern. Instead of justifying distance as independence, they begin to question whether it is actually protection. Instead of labeling emotional intensity as danger, They start to wonder whether it might simply be depth. This shift from reaction to reflection is where healing starts to enter the picture. For many avoidant individuals, life has been structured around emotional control. Control over how close people get, control over how much they feel, control over when to engage and when to withdraw. This creates a predictable emotional environment, but growth challenges that predictability. It asks them to stay present even when discomfort appears. It asks them to communicate instead of disappearing. It asks them to tolerate emotional intensity without escaping it immediately. At first, this feels unnatural. The instinct to retreat does not disappear quickly. In fact, when someone tries to break an avoidant pattern, the discomfort can feel even stronger because they are no longer using their usual coping mechanism, sitting with a mochi. And instead of escaping, it can feel unfamiliar, even unsafe. But this is exactly where transformation begins. Not when it feels easy, but when it feels unfamiliar, and they choose to stay anyway. One of the most important parts of growth is learning emotional tolerance. This does not mean becoming overwhelmed by feelings, but learning that feelings are not threats. Emotions rise and fall, like waves. They do not require immediate escape. When an avoidant person begins to understand that emotional intensity is temporary and survivable, their entire relationship with connection starts to change. They no longer see closeness as something that must be controlled or avoided. They begin to see it as something that can be experienced safely, even if it feels intense at times. Another key aspect of growth is accountability. Avoidant patterns often develop as protection, not intention. But at some point, healing requires acknowledging the impact of those patterns, not just on others, but on oneself. Anmon. Avoiding emotional responsibility may reduce discomfort in the moment, but it also limits depth in relationships. Growth involves recognizing that emotional withdrawal has consequences and that connection requires participation, not just observation from a distance. As awareness deepens, a new possibility emerges. Choosing connection without losing self. This is the point where avoidant individuals begin to understand that vulnerability is not the same as weakness. Expressing feelings does not mean losing control. Being close to someone does not mean losing independence. In fact, real emotional maturity is the ability to stay connected while still maintaining personal identity. Over time, this realization slowly rewires internal responses. Instead of automatically withdrawing, there becomes a pause. Instead of immediate shutdown, there becomes reflection. Instead of seeing emotional closeness as danger, there becomes curiosity. These shifts may seem small, but they represent significant internal change. Ultimately, growth is not about becoming someone entirely different. It is about expanding emotional capacity. It is about learning that what once felt overwhelming can be understood, processed, and held without escape. And when an avoidant individual reaches that point of awareness, they are no longer just surviving emotional experiences. They are finally beginning to participate in them fully.